Michael had never been a fan of hospitals. The sterile smell of disinfectant, the sound of beeping machines, and the sight of sickly patients lying in their beds always made him uneasy. But he never imagined just how much he would come to dread those places until he found himself lying in a hospital bed, trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. It all started when Michael began experiencing excruciating headaches. At first, he tried to ignore them, chalking them up to stress and lack of sleep. But as the pain became more intense and frequent, he knew he had to seek medical attention. So, he made an appointment with his doctor and was referred to a specialist. The specialist ordered some tests and scans, and soon, Michael found himself being admitted to the hospital for further evaluation. He was told that he would need surgery to remove a tumor that had been discovered in his brain. The news was devastating, but Michael tried to stay positive. He was assured that the procedure was routine, and that he would make a full recovery. The day of the surgery arrived, and Michael was prepped for the procedure. He was given an anesthesia and drifted off to sleep, trusting that he was in good hands. But when he woke up, he realized that something was very wrong. He was no longer in the same room he had been in before the surgery. Instead, he was in a dimly lit room that looked more like a dungeon than a hospital. The walls were made of rough stone, and there were no windows. The only light came from a single flickering bulb that hung from the ceiling. Michael tried to call out for help, but he found that he could not speak. Panic set in as he realized that he was completely paralyzed. He could feel his body, but he could not move a muscle. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own body. As he lay there, helpless and alone, he began to hear strange noises coming from the darkness. At first, it was just a faint scratching sound, like something was dragging across the floor. But then, the noises grew louder and more sinister. Michael could hear something moving closer and closer to him, and he could feel his heart racing in his chest. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a nurse, but there was something off about her. Her eyes were hollow and sunken, and her skin was pale and clammy. She moved towards him with slow, deliberate steps, and Michael could see that she was holding a large syringe in her hand. He tried to scream, to beg for mercy, but no sound came out. The nurse leaned over him, and he could feel her breath on his face. She whispered something in his ear, but he could not make out the words. Then, with a swift motion, she plunged the syringe into his arm. Michael felt a sharp pain shoot through his body, and then everything went black. When he woke up again, he was back in his hospital bed. At first, he thought it had all been a nightmare. But as he looked around the room, he realized that something was different. The walls were covered in a thick layer of grime, and there were strange symbols etched into the ceiling. The machines that had been monitoring his vital signs were gone, replaced by archaic-looking instruments that he did not recognize. He tried to call for help, but his voice was hoarse and weak. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy and unresponsive. He was terrified, unsure of what was happening to him. Suddenly, the door to his room creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was the same nurse from his nightmare, her face twisted into a grotesque sneer. She approached his bed, and Michael tried to shrink away from her, but he was trapped. "Welcome back, Michael," she said in a low, menacing voice. "I hope you're feeling better now." Michael tried to speak, to ask her what was happening to him, but the words caught in his throat. The nurse laughed and leaned in closer, her breath hot on his face. "Don't worry, Michael," she whispered. "We're going to take good care of you here. You're going to be with us for a very long time." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as the nurse turned and walked out of the room, leaving him alone in the darkness once again. He knew then that he was not in a normal hospital, that something sinister was happening to him. But he had no idea how to escape. Days turned into weeks, and Michael's situation only grew worse. He was visited by the nurse and other strange figures, all of them muttering cryptic words and performing bizarre rituals around his bed. He was subjected to painful experiments and treatments that left him weak and disoriented. He tried to resist, to fight back, but his body was too weak, and his mind was clouded with drugs. As time went on, Michael began to lose track of reality. He wasn't sure if what he was experiencing was real or if it was all just a hallucination brought on by his condition. But one thing was certain: he was trapped, and he needed to find a way out. One night, as he lay in his bed, he heard a faint scratching sound coming from the wall. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but as the sound grew louder, he realized that it was something else entirely. He watched in horror as a small crack appeared in the wall, widening into a small hole. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, and a low growl echoed through the room. Michael knew then that he was not alone in the hospital. The creature emerged from the hole, and Michael could see that it was a large, hulking beast, covered in matted fur and sharp claws. It advanced towards him, its eyes fixed on him, and Michael tried to move, to escape, but he was powerless. Just as the creature was about to pounce, the door to his room burst open, and a team of doctors and nurses rushed inside. They subdued the creature with tranquilizers and then turned to Michael, a look of shock and horror on their faces. "We're so sorry, Michael," one of the doctors said, tears streaming down her face. "We had no idea. We never should have brought you here." It turned out that Michael had been brought to an abandoned hospital that had been taken over by a cult that practiced dark rituals and experiments on their patients. The nurse and other figures that he had seen were members of the cult, and they had been using him as a test subject for their twisted experiments. Michael was rescued and taken to a real hospital, where he was treated for his injuries and the effects of the drugs that had been forced upon him. It took him months to recover physically and mentally, but eventually, he was able to leave the hospital and resume his life. But the experience had left a lasting impact on him. He was haunted by nightmares and flashbacks of his time in the cult's hospital, and he struggled with anxiety and paranoia. He had lost his trust in the medical system, and he was always on guard, afraid that something like this could happen to him again. Despite his trauma, Michael tried to move on with his life. He sought therapy and support groups to help him cope with his experiences, and he tried to find meaning in his suffering. He spoke out against the cult and the medical professionals who had failed to protect him, hoping to prevent others from experiencing the same horrors that he had. Years went by, and Michael slowly began to rebuild his life. He formed new relationships, pursued his passions, and found joy in small moments of happiness. But he never forgot what had happened to him, and he never stopped fighting for justice and accountability. One day, he received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from the cult, apologizing for what they had done to him and offering compensation for his suffering. Michael was shocked and hesitant at first, but eventually, he decided to accept their offer. He saw it as a chance to finally close this chapter of his life and move forward. But when he arrived at the meeting place that the cult had specified, he realized that it was all a trap. They had lured him back into their clutches, and they had no intention of letting him go again. Michael found himself once again trapped in the cult's twisted world, forced to endure even more pain and suffering. But this time, he was not alone. He had learned from his previous experience, and he was determined to fight back. He rallied the other victims of the cult, and together, they planned their escape. They worked in secret, gathering information and resources, until they were finally ready to make their move. In a daring and dangerous operation, they broke free from the cult's grasp, fighting their way to freedom. They emerged battered and bruised, but victorious, and Michael finally felt that he had truly moved on from his hospital horror story. From that day on, he devoted his life to helping others who had been victimized by similar organizations. He became an advocate for survivors of medical abuse and cults, sharing his story and raising awareness about the dangers of these groups. Despite the trauma he had endured, Michael had found a purpose in his suffering. He had turned his hospital horror story into a testament of resilience and hope, inspiring others to never give up in the face of adversity.